So just a brief introduction here. This presentation by Stoddard Lane about Stoddard Lane was sparked by two of our former members, Mark and Janet Rosenberry, who were very interested in knowing more about Stoddard Lane, the man whose portrait hangs in our tower room. And so they commissioned some research to be done by Drake University's Department of Philosophy and Religion, Dr. Kenneth Nepper, and Timothy. Did I say Kenneth? Timothy Nepper, I'm sorry. And it turned out that the timing was pretty good because when Tim came to look at the archives and approached Plymouth about finding some information about Stoddard, he found that the archives were in pretty sad shape. And we had just organized a archive committee, sort of driven by Lorna Truck, who is a Plymouth member and a retired librarian. So all of this kind of came together at the same time. Our archive committee was starting to pull things out and try to organize a dismal room. And Timothy and his students came in to help us. And so they could pull out and we could sort out the things that were appropriate to refer to Dr. Lane. So that's how it all started. And we had spent really the last year doing, pulling out the archives. They took all of what they found that pertained to Dr. Lane, did their research, digitized them up for us, which is a terrific service for Plymouth Church. Our committee, some of whose members are here today, now have the big job of taking all the rest of these bins of files, organizing and digitizing them. So as we find more stories, we hope to bring them to you and have a better understanding of the history of our church and how it online, maybe have some visual displays and some presentations like this. So today we have a presentation by Allie Shambaugh-Miller, and she is a graduate from Drake University. She just graduated in May with a double major in history and sociology and a religion minor. And this fall, she'll be attending Simmons University in Boston for an MA to pursue a master's in library and information science with a concentration in archival management. So she said this project merged two of her passions, preserving archival collections and furthering religious and interfaith. So this is a preview of a fuller report that she's going to write that will be in the Plymouth Magazine. So we will let her do a presentation and take some questions.
Thank you so much, Amy, for the introduction. So basically shared the entire spiel that I was going to say at the beginning, but I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about Reverend Stoddard Lane, who is the minister of Plymouth Church.
You need to speak
a little louder. Okay, yeah.
We don't have a mic here. Is that right? Yeah. So
no worries. I will.
I don't know.
This room is not mic.
I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So tell me, is this loud enough?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Well, if you can keep that up.
Okay. I will try to speak this loud for the entirety of the presentation. So today I'm going to be talking about Reverend Stoddard Lane, who was the minister of Plymouth Church from 1929 to 1943 when he died. I'm really grateful to be talking to you guys about this project. It was such a joy to work on, and I was very lucky that I was chosen to work on this project because, like Amy said, it really does merge two of my passions, which are for religious studies and then also for history and archives. So we'll show you a picture first here of the archival room that we're going through all of the documents with. So a storage closet. And the archives committee was so amazing to let me come in here with one of my coworkers, Gracie Geist, and we pulled out as many documents as we could that were related to Stoddard Lane. So I actually have some of them pulled out here. If people want to look at them after the presentation, you are more than welcome to. Just be careful when you touch them because they're old. But the best part about these collections is like physically interacting with them. That's my favorite thing. There are 110 items in the Stoddard Lane papers, which is what we called them. I transferred the documents to Drake University. I work at the archives and special collections there. And so the staff there was very kind, let me bring everything in. I put it all in folders, put it in an order that made sense. I did it in chronological order based on Stoddard Lane's life. So we start with his call and installation as the pastor in 1929, leading all the way up until his death in 1943. And then just some other documents that I found that had a lot to do with Stoddard Lane, but weren't necessarily part of his life. So some church histories that had a lot to do with him, the memorial windows that were put up, which I'll also talk about today, some assorted documents that didn't have any date with them, and then the external hard drive of everything that I digitized. So I was able to use one of the scanners at the Drake Archives and put everything onto this external hard drive. All the images that you'll see today were digitized using that. So, like I said, there is 110 items in the Stoddard Lane papers with dates ranging from 1929 to 1980. So this is everything from newspaper clippings to church bulletins. We have correspondence, and my favorite thing is the 34 original sermon manuscripts that we have from Stoddard Lane.
Wow.
Yes, so they are like so interesting to read through, and I'll mention some quotes from some of them today. But currently, we are working on making everything that is digitized available online on the Plymouth website so that people can interact with them. And that's the one thing that I would tell people really to look into is those sermons, because they are so fascinating. He was an amazing author and orator. And so it's really a glimpse back into the 1930s and the early 1940s, because all of his sermons were talking about very pertinent information to what was going on in the world. And like I said, this is just going to be a really brief presentation, the preview of a larger article that I'll be writing for the Plymouth Magazine. So yeah, I'm just going to give you a brief overview today. So Stoddard Lane was born on July 2nd, 1887 in Connecticut. That means he would have been 136 a couple of weeks ago if he was still alive. Obviously, a little old. He attended various colleges in the Northeast, including Amherst, which is pictured here on the right. He collected some degrees, got 2 of his bachelor's degree, a master's, and then he would eventually go back and get another master's and a PhD. In July of 1916, while serving as a pastor in New Jersey, his first wife, Anna Hepburn, died during childbirth. This was the birth of his son, Stoddard Lane Jr., who did survive. And then in 1917, Lane enlisted to serve in the Army Ambulance Corps during World War I. In his 2 years, he started as a private, and then he was promoted to a corporal and then a sergeant. He was 30 at the time of his enlistment, so he was quite a bit older than everyone else in his unit. They were called the Amherst Black Cats because most of the soldiers in the unit came from Amherst College. But the fact that he was a lot older and was already serving as a minister, he provided a lot of spiritual guidance. He often hosted services for Christmas, Easter, there's some for Mother's Day, and everything that we know about that comes from his diaries. So Stoddard Lane kept diaries during the entirety of his service in the military. Those are kept at Amherst College. And in, 2021, Jim Hamilton, who was a researcher at Plymouth, came across the diaries while researching the Amherst Black Cats, and he compiled them all into a book. So we have that book up on the table if anyone wants to flip through it. At the end, it's the copy owned by Plymouth, and it is really fascinating. So I just picked one quote here. He did serve in the Army Ambulance Corps, so he was tending to wounded soldiers. And this one really shows kind of the violence and the terror that he experienced during the war. He said, his right arm had been completely cut off above the elbow. There was nothing I could do but to hold his hand. The ride seemed cruelly endless. He died 15 minutes after arriving, another life sacrificed to the hell of war. I shall never forget that 20-kilo ride. For the rest of his life, Lane would be a staunch pacifist. Even entering World War II, he consistently advocated that America should not enter the war. And that was grounded in his experience serving in the Army Ambulance Corps, seeing so many young men die when he was only 30 years old. He did receive the Croix de Guerre for his service in for heroism in combat. And then he also received one other award, but I can't remember what it was, but it is in that book. Shortly after his return in June of 1920, Lane married Stella H. Lane. They would remain married for the rest of his life and have 3 daughters together. And she played a huge role in his ministry. She herself was a very accomplished author of children's books. And then she was very, very involved in the children's ministry here at Plymouth in restarting like the children's education youth programs. And I wish I had more time to talk today because her life is really, really fascinating, but I won't have a lot of time to talk about it. Yes, that is something that can be revisited, which is awesome. So a couple of years passed. In April of 1929, Bertus McHatton, who was the senior minister of Plymouth, retired, and they began commencing their search for a new minister. At the time, Lane was serving as the minister of First Congregational Church in Manchester, New Hampshire. They invited Lane to speak. He was picked out of a pool of 25 ministers from all across the United States. And it's a little hard to see here, but this is the letter that they sent out to the congregation, urging them strongly to really come to the service. They said, let's see, at Plymouth Church, it is probable that this will be the most important meeting in Plymouth Church this year, and we therefore urge, no matter what your plans may be, that you do your best to let nothing interfere with your being present. Which I found pretty funny. Yes, no, it's actually, Rachel just mentioned that it's glad to see that there was a sense of humor back then. And that's one of the things that I really like about this collection is through some of the letters and a couple of the just little things that we see, Dr. Lane had a great sense of humor. He wrote some really funny stuff. So it's nice it's very humanizing to see that people were the same back in 1929 as we are today. So after he came and spoke, he did accept the role as senior minister of Plymouth, moved all the way over here. And that was when his ministry started. Technically, he didn't start as the minister until 1930, but they typically say that his ministry started in 1929. So I could talk for a very long time about all of the small and large details of Dr. Lane's life, but I think I just want to focus today on a couple of things that I think will be both interesting and useful to you guys. And that is the topic of livable or lived Christianity that Dr. Lane tried to enact throughout his entire ministry, and more specifically, the areas of social and political life where Stoddard Lane really did this. And it's important to remember that Lane, he was groundbreaking. He did some amazing new things for Plymouth, but he was building on a tradition that had already been established. Plymouth was already an extremely socially active congregation, going all the way back to its founding, which I will talk about. To kind of ground some of the things that he did in his congregation, I want to talk about his kind of perspective or that theory that he had behind it. This is a newspaper article about his very first sermon that he gave at Plymouth Church in October of 1929, as reported in the Des Moines Register. This was another interesting thing that newspapers really, they did used to report on what was happening in churches in the newspaper. It's not something that we see today as often. The Des Moines Register and other newspapers would often write about sermons that he was giving or events that were going on, even doing like write-up profiles of him and things like that. But in this article and in his sermon, he argues that rather than getting caught up in arguments of doctrine or how to properly interpret the Bible, the really important thing is how is Christianity lived in your everyday life. In this last quote, he says, Dr. Lane voiced the belief that Jesus today would visit not the churches to find out about modern life, but rather would visit the homes and working places. They mark the lives of any people. So Lane believed, that the most important thing, and the thing that Jesus really would be concerned about as well, was not what's going on in the church, but what's going on outside of it and how Christians are impacting that world, which I think still rings true in Plymouth today, based on what I know about your congregation. And really, he was not living in a world too dissimilar from ours. There was huge economic inequality. There was rising tides of nationalism. There was war, violence, racial and religious discrimination. and really big questions about what the place of religion was in politics and economics. So while Lane navigated this during the Great Depression and World War II, a lot of the lessons that he was talking about still ring true today. These are two other quotes from two of Lane's sermons. The first one says, "Here then are some of the ways in which I think we have made some approach to teaching a livable religion by living it. I think that the way of Christ is the way of human concern. And I think that this church has increasingly become a church of human concern. We are learning to say with Jesus, it is people that matter most." Again, bringing that idea that Christian teachings are a call to action in the social world. In the second quote, that's a little bit longer, and I won't read the whole thing, but Lane defends why this social realm matters so much. He's delivering the claim that faith is impacted by the conditions under which a person lives. Yes, of course, faith can survive all adverse conditions if it's strong, poverty and war and violence. But there are real things that we can do in the world to foster people's faith, creating peace, prosperity, and equality. And if it is the Christian duty to help develop faith in others, Christians have to address the social conditions which make it difficult or easier to have faith. Lane really addressed three of these social conditions throughout his ministry. The first was racial inequality, the second, religious tolerance and interfaith understanding, and the third, war. Of course, he addressed so many other social issues during this time. He really championed for youth education. The Board of Religious Education was restarted while he was a pastor. He also advocated for an increase in the number of women on advisory boards at Plymouth, and he participated in a lot of public health campaigns, food drives, stuff like that. And you can see this all throughout newspaper articles that reported on it. Also within the church bulletins, when it says the weekly events that were going on, we see so many of those happening, but obviously I cannot talk about all of them today. But the first one that I want to talk about is Lane's work for racial equality. This was a tradition, like I said, that went all the way back to the founding of the church. The group that founded the church in the 19th century, was staunchly anti-slavery and advocated for slavery's abolition. I found one source that even claimed that Plymouth was a stop on the Underground Railroad under its second minister, obviously different building than this one today. But Lane's belief in racial equality was grounded again in scripture. He had this conviction that every person was equal before God, so they had to be equal before men. He wrote in 1942, "Who am I to say that I with my white skin am worth more to God than the other man with his black skin? Believing in the value of men before God, I will treat them as valuable regardless of nationality of color." When he was interviewed in 1937 by the Des Moines Register, he did admit that there were no African-American members at Plymouth Church, but, I quote, "I wish we had some. It would be a fine thing for the church." Most churches in Iowa were still unofficially segregated by race, but this did not prevent Lane from engaging in fellowship with other churches, predominantly African-American churches. We see examples of the Young People's Society, which was a youth group for, members in their 20s. And they would often visit Corinthian Baptist Church for fellowship services. They would exchange choirs. They would engage in community service together. Corinthian is, of course, still standing today. They have a building downtown. And other congregation members fondly recall being children when Reverend and Mrs. Lane would welcome African-American children from other congregations to fellowship parties. Plymouth also observed Race Relations Sunday in 1941. So this was an event that was both spiritual and political. Again, a combination which Stoddard Lane would champion throughout his entire life. The event included a panel discussion and singing of spirituals by the Burns Methodist Quartet. Burns Methodist Church also still operates today. And this event was planned partially by members of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. This was an interfaith organization of which Lane was an integral member. I believe it operated from 1928 until sometime in the 90s, and the organization isn't operating anymore, but it was really interesting, and I'll talk about it a little bit. So Reverend Lane was extremely invested in establishing interfaith relationships between Plymouth's congregation and other houses of worship in the city. His definition of interfaith might seem very narrow to us now because it only included Catholics, Protestant Christians, and Jews. There was no involvement of Muslim congregations, of Hindu temples, anything like that. But it was still groundbreaking at the time. There was a lot of anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish sentiment that was stirring up in the 1920s and 1930s, which he felt the need to address. Documents from the 75th anniversary of Plymouth Church in December of 1932 contain some of the first references to Reverend Lane's interfaith relationships. Invited to speak at the celebration of Plymouth's 75th anniversary were Catholic Reverend Father Stoll, Jewish Rabbi Eugene Mannheimer, Presbyterian Reverend James T. Morty, and Baptist Reverend George W. Robinson. Modern readers might also be familiar with some of the names of other attendees. There was newspaper editor Harvey Ingham, after which a building is dedicated to Drake University, Grinnell President John S. Nolan, and politician James B. Weaver. So after only 3 years of coming to Plymouth, it's clear that Lane had already developed and taken a role as a very influential member of of Des Moines community, both politically and religiously. You can see here on the left, Lane's personal invitation to Rabbi Mannheimer to come and speak at the event. Mannheimer was a close personal friend of Lane. His synagogue, Temple B'nai Jeshurun, which still operates today as well, was across the street from Lane's house. The two worked closely together on the National Conference of Jews and Christians. Along with the Catholic priest, Father Robert Walsh, the three composed the Des Moines Brotherhood Trio. So they traveled all across Iowa, hosting events, sometimes with thousands of people coming out to attend. These were often at churches, community centers, even at homes. But they would basically engage in conversation both civilly, but also with great humor. We see articles talking about how they would poke fun at each other, and they would use humor to really show how these friendships could work, while also really answering some deep questions about, okay, what are the philosophical and doctrinal differences between our religions? There is a fantastic article written about the Brotherhood Trio in the Annals of Iowa by Bill R. Douglas. And this is available online. If you just search Stoddard Lane Interfaith or Stoddard Lane Brotherhood Trio, you'll be able to find it on there. But it's really interesting. Lane espoused that different religions should not just interact with tolerance and with kindness, but they also had a lot to learn from each other. And we can see this most, again, in that relationship with Rabbi Mannheimer and Temple B'nai Jeshurun. In 1937, Lane started an event called An Adventure in Understanding the Jew. Believing that Christians ought to have a greater understanding of the Old Testament, he brought middle school and high school students to visit the temple. And there, Rabbi Mannheimer talked to them about the symbolism of the temple, central aspects of Judaism, and also what they could learn that continued into Jesus' life. The relationship between the rabbi and the reverend was so strong that in February of 1940, when Lane was sick with the flu, the rabbi took over the pulpit and spoke at Plymouth Sunday service. I found very interesting. He even once spoke at the Plymouth Men's Club on the topic, "What is happening in Palestine?" which I also found to be really interesting. Lane's dedication to friendships between Jews and Christians was memorialized in the stained glass windows in the sanctuary that are dedicated to him. The first shows his love of sailing, and the second includes a Star of David. And I'd encourage you all to go and look at them again. Yes, that is why a Star of David is there, which I found really interesting. Lane was very much of the belief that the Old Testament had a lot of significance to how Christians needed to live today, and that knowledge of the Old Testament was very important, and knowing the Jewish roots. Finally, the last aspect of Lane's ministry I want to talk about is his pacifist ideology. So to us in the 21st century, I think for a lot of people, it seems inevitable that the US would end up in World War II, and that it was overwhelmingly a good thing that we became involved. I think some people would say that. But for a lot of years, it appeared that the US would be able to stay out of a war that they regarded as Europe's war. And a lot of American citizens actively campaigned against US involvement, like Lane. He regularly hosted discussions and panels about how to keep America out of the war. He hosted these with parents and teachers, where they gathered at the church to discuss fears of US involvement and their sons being called. Lane repeated the same line that he often used, that even if the US did become involved, they should be working the entire time towards peace, because peace was something that doesn't just happen, it has to be built. And this is a line that he repeats throughout a lot of his sermons and the articles that he spoke for, was that peace is something that has to be built. It doesn't just happen passively. And he used the example of what happened in in US policy towards Germany after the First World War, which really pushed Germany, the German people, into fascism and into embracing Hitler. He noted, when peace comes, the United States should make every effort to make it a just peace, so that the troubles which began with Versailles will not be visited upon us again. Lane also established or proposed the establishment of the Committee on International Relations in 1931. And the first thing that he wanted them to talk about was the disarmament at the Geneva Convention. So it's really clear that Lane did not see the church as just a place solely for worship. It was a place where Christians could also worship through their actions and engagements with problems in the social sphere. We see a really immense commitment to the exchange of free ideas, which is, of course, a tenet of congregationalism, that democracy in a congregation and exchange of free ideas. One thing that I found really interesting was that in 1939, the same 20 Club was hosting a discussion of can America stay out of the war? And invited to speak was Robert Carson, Iowa organizer of the Communist Party. I found really interesting. In 1939, with the environment, obviously, the way that communism was approached in the United States, he also does speak about communism and communist ideology in a lot of the sermons, not embracing it, but kind of addressing where communism kind of connects with Christianity. Very interesting. And I'd encourage you all, once we get those uploaded, to look at those. But also, he did not go without criticism. This was a letter to the reader, or letter from the reader in the Des Moines Register, where Mr. Parton Smith is talking about his opinion of Stoddard Lane and of the Des Moines Register itself, talking about their leaning towards Russian and the Stalinites, and calling Stoddard Lane their protege and using an expletive to talk about what they think Stoddard Lane is doing, which I just also found a little funny. But Lane often preached about tolerance and understanding, even for those on the opposite side of the war. I'm going to read this quote almost in its entirety because to me it was so powerful when I was reading it. And as I was reading it, I just kept thinking, this is exactly what we're going through today as a country. And it still has a lot of lessons for us. So he said, God save us also from the sin of hate. Here is another thing the church could do. It can help to save us from the sin of hate. In a time of war, it is hard not to hate. There are some things we ought to. We ought to hate war itself. We ought to hate the evils that produce war and the evils of Hitlerism and the suppressions and barbarisms of totalitarianism. We do not need to hate the German people or the Japanese people. After all, they are people very much like ourselves. They're not essentially different from ourselves. They're not inherently war lovers and men killers. Due to education and environment, many of them may be more militaristic and more war-minded than the rest of us. They are not different by nature. Fundamentally, people are the same the world over. There are good and bad people in every nation, but they are all the children of God. This quote can, of course, be interpreted however you like, but I just found it really powerful for framing kind of what our country is going through today and the perspective that Plymouth members may have on it. Lane lived out what he said about tolerance for people on the opposite side of the war. He organized a panel for Japanese American students to speak at Plymouth. This was the first event of its kind in Des Moines. And even from his sickbed in 1943, he published letters and editorials urging for tolerance towards Japanese Americans. To bring all of this together, I want to talk about Plymouth's motto, which is, of course, attributed to Stoddard Lane. This was a question that Mark was really interested in. Where does the motto come from? And unfortunately, I could not find the original place that it is cited, but I did find from his funeral bulletin in 1943, we have a longer version of it here. And I'll just read the first half, where it says, "We impose no creeds. We do not insist on uniformity of theology or belief. We think there is room in a church for differences of opinion. We believe in the right of private judgment and in the possibility of diversity in unity. Therefore, we believe in the freedom of the pulpit and of the pew. We take as our motto, we agree to differ, we resolve to love, we unite to serve. I think with a full understanding of Stoddard Lane's life and his own dedication to service, to agreeing with difference, to loving, we really see this quote in a new light.
I hate to interrupt. It was Eden Seminary is where the motto came from.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay. That's good to know because I could not find anything that actually cited it.
It's changed.
Right.
Where?
Eden Seminary.
Seminary?
Where's that? In St. Louis.
St. Louis? Yes. Thank you. So fundamentally, Lane condemned what he called the sin of indifference. This was what he said was one of the greatest sins, was not caring or not engaging at all. He advocated for and demonstrated what lived Christianity looked like. He actively championed for social change, church involvement in politics, and tolerance and empathy for those that we disagree with. And I think this is a lesson that still has value today. The last sermon that we have from Reverend Lane was given on January 17th, 1943, only months before his death. It was titled Christianity is a Tradition. And in it, Lane admitted that he and many other Congregationalists were wary of relying too much on tradition, that we're always looking forward towards progress, social change, that sort of thing. But he said that Christianity has to hold on to certain aspects of the past because it is the same river always moving. He notes that Plymouth Church, too, is a tradition. He says that they owe their liberalism, their democratic spirit to the founders of the church back in the 19th century. And when I found this quote, it really resonated with me as, an amateur historian and archivist and this entire project as a whole. He wrote, Plymouth Church is not simply us. It is a long line of men and women who, for 86 years, have poured their lives into this church. Plymouth is a tradition. It is not only a present possession, it is a rich heritage passed along to us by the past. God help us to be worthy of it, to hold fast to the best of yesterday, and to make tomorrow even better. And I think that's a great way to frame kind of this project, but also the forthcoming archival projects that are happening, reflections on Plymouth's history. I hope that today I gave you a little bit more perspective on Stoddard Lane, maybe where some of the origins of Plymouth's culture come from, and also moving into the future. So thank you so much. So I would be happy to take any questions that anyone may have. Yes?
Just wondered, did you happen in your research see any link between Stoddard Lane and Henry A. Wallace?
Yeah, the question was if there's any link between Stoddard Lane and Henry Wallace. Henry A. Wallace. I believe I saw that name potentially in one of the letters or a newspaper article, but it wasn't something I came across a lot. That's not to say that everything that's in this collection is his entire story, because there's so much more information out there. I could have done a search on newspaper articles online, stuff that's digitized as well, but I wanted to keep it just contained to this stuff here so it wasn't too overwhelming, and also stuff that you guys could eventually have access to. But I do remember seeing that name before, but yeah. Yes.
I think I remember seeing sightings in the Plymouth bulletins that
Yes.
Henry Wallace came to talk to the men's group a couple of times.
Yeah, there's definitely potential. Yes.
Mentioned about the war diaries. Are those accessible from Amherst?
The question was about Stoddard Lane's war diaries, if they're accessible. I don't believe that they've been digitized. I know that.
They're for sale. $25.
Yeah, so there is this.
Self-published. Not self-published, but a small publisher. And so I think we can have this in the library for people to check out.
Yes. Yeah, so that has all of his, there's on each page, there's a scan of the page, and then he has transcribed it. So, because his handwriting was a little difficult to read, it was cursive. So that does have the transcribed letters. I know, I was young people, so I guess I shouldn't have said that. But also the nice thing about that, it does have a full introduction outlining his war service. some articles and editorials that he wrote after it. And it's also annotated with kind of details that help you to understand what he's talking about if he mentions a specific battle, a specific individual. So yeah, when that becomes available in the library, definitely check it out. Yes.
Well, first, thank you so much for this presentation. It was wonderfully put together. It looks like you did so much work and it obviously shows. I was wondering, were you able to glean the reaction from when Stoddard said, you know, we should have more, we should embrace Japanese Americans? I know it was a difficult time. So were you able to see the public opinion at all?
That was one thing that I did not, it was difficult in this collection to kind of get what the reception was of a lot of the stuff that he was doing. There was some minor criticisms for, sometimes he was told he was too politically involved, or people from outside of the congregation said, you have no place to be saying these things. But from what I could glean, it seemed that within the congregation, it was very warmly embraced and welcomed. Just based on the newspaper articles, the way that they talk about it. There are the minutes of the Board of Deacons, which are not included in the actual collection because there's a lot of stuff in there that isn't just related to Stoddard Lane. But I did look through those, and it seemed that whenever he proposed something, it was mostly embraced. So the Board of International Relations, anytime he wanted to do fellowship with a temple or another church, it was always accepted. Sometimes there was some minor discussion if the cost was seen to be too much, but from what I could glean, it seemed that what he was trying to do was embraced by the congregation, which I think says a lot about the congregation itself, that he was mirroring values that the church already had and furthering them. Yes?
I was born the year after he died.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother was in this congregation. I felt like I knew he talking about it. Another person.
Mm-hmm.
She also, their family, and the major started. And so she reported, she's not, but she reported very strongly. He was very well accepted. Congregation. But of course, that was just her opinion. But I have another question for you.
Sure.
I helped. Gwen Russ was the person. His wife evidently wrote stories.
Yes.
And something about giants and children.
Yes. She was a very active children's book author. It's The Giant Who Eats Chocolate Cake, I think is the one that you're referring to. There is a newspaper article in here of she was doing a reading of it at a department store. So yes, that would be accurate about her book.
We found copies of that.
Oh, good.
And
Oh,
she,
I'm afraid
I believe it was the one who originated the children's sermons, wasn't that, or was that Frisbee's wife? Anyway, both of those wives were very, very active, and they, and we'll have more about them because they were very impressive in their own right.
Yes, in the back.
Did any other UCC churches, or was it the UCC church back there, but did any other congregational churches try to pick him off over his career?
Ooh, like once he was at Plymouth?
Like try to hire him away?
Not that I know about.
it's small to be able to do it.
Yeah, Plymouth was,
Biggest church in Iowa that's, now UCC. But
yes.
Congregational, so I don't think anybody could have given it the second.
Yeah, Plymouth was the largest church, the largest congregational church in Iowa. And I didn't see anything of offers from other churches or ones that were trying to attract him there. Not to say that there wasn't, we just don't have any information regarding it. Yes.
This is a more personal question about you, but I was a student at the University of Iowa campus, and there's a Shambaugh auditorium. Remember attending area events? Is that related to you?
No, the question was if I'm related to any of the famous or well-known Iowa Shambaughs, and I am not. I'm from Nebraska originally. I don't think I am. I get asked that a lot, so I should look into it more, but as far as I know, no, I'm not related to
I
anyone.
never go on finding your roots.
Yes. Yes. Yes, in the back.
I appreciate what you said about Stoddard Lane meeting with the rabbi and the priest. Because when I was started here in 1980 and became part of the deacons and all, that's what Jim Gilliam did.
Mm-hmm.
And he met pretty regularly with them and almost once a month. And they were even on the radio and had different conversations. So I didn't know there was a thread of that. And so thank you for charging.
Yes, it was actually the national organization that did it. They had their own goodwill team on the national level that was modeled the same way: Catholic priest, Protestant minister, Jewish rabbi. But so then like the smaller chapters, like the Iowa chapter, the Des Moines one, they adopted it. So Lane and the people he was working with were modeling after that. But apparently they were like overwhelmingly more popular and they were reported on at the national level and stuff like that. So there's a lot. It's really interesting.
In connection with this one comment, in connection with that, the female equivalent of that made a difference in my life living in Indianola because people like, I want to say Goodman, there was a Jewish woman, Catholic, Indianola didn't want Roman Catholics, he didn't have church, and that group talked to Indianola high school students like me who said, "Oh, you know, we don't have these folks here." And it made a big impression. And the fact that it moved out of being just academics into, you know, we're mothers and bringing up the issue of Friday night football. Never heard. So I just think he started something, but I experienced something that was related to his work.
That's fantastic. I did not know that there would eventually be a women's involvement in that. So that is,
And some of you know who those women are. I'm really for.
that's really fascinating.
I was gonna say that while we're on the topics of Allie and interfaith, I met you 4 years ago this month when Allie attended our interfaith youth camp at Drake. That was the 3rd annual, I think.
I think so.
The next year she'd go on to be a counselor. She would be the president of Drake's Student Interfaith Board and eventually one of my interfaith fellows. And here we are today visiting you. We're running the interfaith camp this week at Drake, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 campers in the back. Raise your hands. Representing different religious traditions, and then 2 Drake students who are counselors up here in the front, with Catalina as kind of the new Allie, one of my interfaith fellows.
The politics of when you first came to Iowa and the congregational structure of the church nationally, was there a pulpit that he saw to that was wider than just the singular church at Plymouth? Because I recognized at one point that he spoke at a Nebraska congregational group of gathering, but I don't understand the politics of the nationwide church of congregation, because some churches are more connectional than maybe Plymouth has ever been.
That's a good question, and I don't remember the answer, but I do remember that he did serve in some sort of leadership role or in a leadership capacity on like a governing board, or not governing, because there wouldn't be that, but
It'd be the conference.
yeah, he did participate in the conference. There are articles about that, and they're actually the Iowa conference he hosted and was one of the lead speakers at, and we do have a bulletin from that. But he was involved with other congregational churches. But I would have to look further into at what level, because I just don't remember right now. But yes.
For your information, that Mannheimer was the leader of the reform movement of Judaism in the United States. So I'm assuming that because of his close friendship, he probably did things on a national level with Mannheimer.
Yes. There is a lot of really interesting information about Mannheimer as well in that article. that I referenced. Yeah, he was a really, really interesting guy as well, Mannheimer was. And I don't know exactly what the origin of their friendship was when they first met. I think it actually was at that National Conference of Jews and Christians. I think that they met there, and that's also where they met Father Stoll. And then I can't remember what year it was, but that was the origin of their friendship. And they obviously, belief-wise, had a lot in common about what they thought. So yeah, really interesting. Yes.
Talk a little bit about his illness and his death, and then he died with.
Yeah, absolutely. So in January, I believe, of 1943, he fell ill. He was experiencing some kind of, let me actually look at one of these because I can't quite remember. I was going to talk about it and then I was taking too long, so I cut it out. Okay, so he had a rheumatic fever complicated by bacterial endocarditis. So he had a bloodstream infection. And so he was taking a leave of absence from the church. He was not preaching, but he was still corresponding with the church and everything. And other ministers were like stepping in for him. But then in May, he had a stroke and he died at his home when he was 55. 55. Yeah, so it was very young. Yeah, it was extremely sudden, and he thought that he was going to recover. And you can see in a letter that he sent to the congregation, he was like, "I'm excited to be back with you soon. This will just be a short bout of illness." And so I think he did fully believe he would recover, but then he had a stroke. So it was very shocking for the congregation. It was shocking for Des Moines as a community because he was so involved. And so there is a plethora of obituaries written about him, entire page spreads, which just goes to show how influential he was. Yeah.
Did his son survive? What family survives, and did any of them go into the family business?
I actually don't know. There is nothing about that. I know there's some stuff written by Stella regarding his children about stuff that they did eventually, but I don't know. I'd have to look into that as well. So, yes, I'm sure. I know his father was a minister. So he was inheriting that, because if you look him up online, it gets kind of complicated because they were both named Stoddard Lane, and you have to like figure out what year we're actually referring to. But yeah.
The foreword of this was written by his granddaughter, I think, Lori Lane Whitaker.
I think it might have been his daughter, actually.
His daughter.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but I've never seen anything about them before. I've never heard pastors.
Yeah. Any other
He kind
questions?
of went out east. He was buried out east.
Yes. Yep. It seems that they went out east after his death. Yes.
As a reminder, summarize, what's your next action with this?
Yeah, so what's going to happen with this is everything is digitized, and I have it all on an external drive, which I'll be giving to the church. And so the technology team, Aaron and everyone can be.
Yeah, so we are currently in the process of revamping Plymouth's website, and we're going to devote a piece of it to archives. So Allie digitized all this, which we should be so grateful for, because it's a huge task. So it will be available online. The other thing is, I encourage you, as Amy mentioned, Allie's going to write a piece for the Plymouth Magazine, but we also have some other of our writers who are going to probably dive a little deeper into this as well. So keep an eye on the magazine. This will be the December issue of the magazine. Our fall issue is already packed and stuff. But I will make sure to send out some details to the congregation about where you can find all the information.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Archives.